Sometimes, in the quietest corners of ancient libraries, between pages that haven't been turned for centuries, there lives a story that history tried to make us forget. Tonight, as the world settles into its evening hush, we are going to remember together a queen whose name was carefully scraped from stone monuments, whose portraits were painted over with lesser faces, but whose spirit refused to disappear completely. Whether you're nestled beneath warm covers in a city apartment or resting in a countryside home where stars peek through your window, I hope you found that perfect position where your body can truly relax. If this gentle tale of forgotten royalty brings you the peace you're seeking tonight, a quiet light helps other weary souls find their way to rest as well. Let your shoulders soften now, feeling how the weight of today begins to melt away like morning frost in gentle sunshine. Notice how your breathing is already becoming slower, deeper, as if your body remembers how to prepare for the journey we're about to take. The temperature around you is just right, your pillows cradling you exactly as they should. We're drifting back through layers of time now, like autumn leaves floating down through golden afternoon light, back to an era when kingdoms were smaller, when candlelight was the only way to push back the darkness, when a young girl who would become our forgotten queen was just beginning to understand that she was different from other children. Her name was Elisande, though you won't find it in the official chronicles. Not anymore. She was born in a castle that overlooked rolling valleys where morning mist would gather like pools of silver silk. The year was somewhere near 1247, though exact dates become hazy when someone has worked so hard to erase them. Her father was Duke Aldrich of Montmoreau, a name you might still find if you know which forgotten manuscripts to search. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, leaving behind only a faint scent of rosewater that seemed to linger in the castle's eastern tower. Little Elisande spent her earliest years in rooms where tapestries swayed gently in the breeze, depicting scenes of unicorns resting in moonlit glades, of ships with purple sails drifting on impossibly calm seas. The floors were covered in rushes that released the softest fragrance of meadowsweet when anyone walked across them. In winter, the great hearths would glow with embers that looked like sleeping dragons' eyes, orange and red and gold, hypnotic in their slow pulsing. The child had an unusual quality that the castle's inhabitants noticed but rarely mentioned aloud. When she entered a room, arguments would trail off into thoughtful silence. When she sat in the garden, birds would gather on nearby branches, not singing exactly, just present, comfortable. The castle's old cat, a grey creature named Smoke who typically avoided everyone, would seek out her lap and purr with a rumble like distant thunder. Her nurse, Marguerite, was a woman whose face had been weathered into something beautiful by years of kindness. She would tell Elisande's stories while braiding the child's hair that was the color of wheat fields just before harvest. These weren't the typical tales of knights and battles. Instead, Marguerite spoke of queens from the far edges of memory. Queens who ruled through wisdom rather than war, who understood that true power moved like water, finding the gentlest path, wearing away resistance not through force, but through patient persistence. There was Queen Alethea, Marguerite would murmur, her fingers moving through Elisande's hair with the rhythm of a lullaby. She lived so long ago that some say she was more dream than woman. Her kingdom prospered not because of armies, but because she knew how to listen, really listen, to the whispers of the wind through grain, to the concerns of the smallest farmer, to the stories stones tell if you're quiet enough. Young Elisander would lean back against Marguerite's comfortable warmth, feeling the older woman's steady breathing, absorbing these tales not just through her ears but through some deeper sense. The afternoon light would slant through the tall windows, catching dust motes that danced like tiny golden spirits, and time would seem to slow, to thicken like honey. The castle where she grew was built on foundations that went deep into the earth. Some said there were passages beneath that connected to caves where ancient peoples had painted stories on the walls. Stories of a time when the boundary between waking and sleeping was softer, more permeable. Elisande would sometimes dream of those caves, of walking through corridors lit by a phosphorescent glow that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Her education began when she was 7, though it wasn't the typical education of a noble child. Her father, Duke Aldrich, was an unusual man, a collector of knowledge from distant lands. His library was legendary, containing texts in languages that most scholars had forgotten existed. He believed that wisdom could be found in unexpected places, in the accounting ledgers of merchant families, in the songs of traveling musicians, in the recipes of kitchen herbs that village healers had passed down for generations. Master Johannes became her tutor, a man whose voice never rose above a gentle murmur. He had traveled from a monastery in the mountains where monks spent their lives illuminating manuscripts with pictures so intricate that looking at them was like falling into a beautiful dream. His robes always carried the faint scent of the special ink they used, made from oak galls and iron, mixed with wine and gum arabic. Under his guidance, Elisande learned to read not just Latin and French, but also Arabic numerals that had recently arrived from the East. She studied the movements of stars across the night sky, learning how ancient peoples had seen stories written in their patterns. The constellation of the swan, the hunter, the great bear, all moving in their eternal peaceful dance. But perhaps more importantly, Master Johannes taught her to observe. A ruler must see what others overlook, he would say, his words floating soft as dandelion seeds. Watch how servants move through rooms when they think no one is looking. Notice which flowers bloom first in spring and which birds arrive with them. Understand that everything is connected by invisible threads. Pull one, and somewhere else, something shifts. The seasons in Montmoreau passed with a gentle rhythm. Spring would arrive with carpets of violets spreading beneath the apple trees, their scent so delicate you might think you imagined it. Summer brought long evenings when the sky would turn shades of peach and lavender, and the air would be filled with the drowsy hum of bees returning to their hives. Autumn painted the forests in colors that seemed too beautiful to be real, amber and rust and gold, while winter wrapped everything in a silence so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath. During these years, Elisande developed friendships with unexpected souls. There was Pierre, the gardener's son, who knew every plant by touch and could predict rain, by the way leaves turned their backs to the wind. Marie, the baker's daughter, whose hands could shape dough into forms that seemed almost alive. And old Benedict, the stable master, who claimed horses had their own language if you knew how to listen. It was Benedict who first taught her to ride, not on the spirited war horses her father's knights used, but on a gentle mare named Twilight, whose coat was the exact shade of the sky just after sunset. "Don't grip so tight," Benedict would advise, his weathered hands steady on the bridle. "A horse responds better to a whisper than a shout, better to a suggestion than a command." Those rides through the countryside revealed a world that moved at a different pace than castle life. They would pass through villages where smoke rose lazily from chimneys, where women sang quiet songs while working their looms, where time was measured not by bells, but by the slow journey of shadows across cottage walls. The paths they followed were ancient, worn smooth by countless generations of feet and hooves, winding between hedgerows where dormice nested, and through groves where the light filtered green and gold. Sometimes they would stop at a particular hill that overlooked the entire valley. From there, Elisander could see how the river curved like a sleeping serpent, how fields formed a patchwork quilt of different greens and golds, how clouds cast moving shadows that transformed the landscape moment by moment. It was there that she first understood what Marguerite had meant about power flowing like water. Her father began to include her in certain castle matters when she turned 12. Not the loud assemblies where knights argued about borders and honors, but the quiet meetings where real decisions were made, where merchant guilds negotiated trade routes, where scholars discussed new techniques for irrigation, where healers shared knowledge about herbs that could ease suffering. Duke Aldrich was aging, his once dark beard now threaded with silver like frost on autumn leaves. His eyes, though, remained sharp and kind. He would have Elisander sit beside him during these meetings, not speaking, just observing, absorbing. Later in the evening, he would ask her what she had noticed. The wool merchant kept touching his left ear when he spoke of prices, she might say, and her father would nod. He was uncertain, perhaps even dishonest. Did you notice how the healer leaned forward when discussing willow bark? That meant she had more knowledge than she was sharing. These lessons were delivered in her father's study, a room where the walls were lined floor to ceiling with books and scrolls, where an astrolabe sat on the desk, its brass curves catching the candlelight, where maps of known and unknown lands were spread across tables, their edges curling like waves. The fireplace there was smaller than the great halls, more intimate, its flames creating shadows that danced gently across the stone walls. It was in this room that Duke Aldrich first spoke to her of marriage, though not in the way she expected. "Power through marriage is a blade that cuts both ways," he said one evening, his voice thoughtful as smoke from his pipe rose in lazy spirals. "The strongest alliances are built on understanding, not contracts. Remember that when your time comes." But Elisander's time would come sooner than anyone expected. News arrived on a grey morning when rain fell so softly it was almost mist. King Lothair had died without male heirs. The succession was disputed. Several dukes claimed the throne through various bloodlines, tangled as brambles. And then someone remembered, or perhaps discovered, that Duke Aldrich's grandmother had been King Lothair's aunt, making Elisander, through a complex web of genealogy, a legitimate claimant. The castle's atmosphere changed like the air before a storm. Though the storm itself remained distant, messengers arrived at all hours, their horses' hooves muffled by the thick mud of autumn roads. Conversations became whispers. Candlelight councils lasted until dawn, painted the sky pale pink. Through it all, Elisander watched, learned, understood that her life was about to transform in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Her father's health, already fragile, began to decline under the pressure. His coughing fits echoed through the stone corridors, each one seeming to steal a little more of his strength. The castle's physician, Master Giles, prescribed rest and warm broths, but everyone could see the Duke was fading like autumn light. It was during one of his better evenings that he called Elisander to his chamber. The room smelled of medicinal herbs, camphor and sage, mixed with the ever-present scent of beeswax candles. He was propped against pillows, his face pale, but his eyes still alert. "The other claimants are warriors," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They understand force, conquest, the language of swords. But you, my dear one, you understand something different, something older, more lasting." He paused to catch his breath, the sound like wind through dry leaves. "If you choose to pursue this crown, and I leave the choice to you, promise me you'll remember Marguerite's stories, Johannes's wisdom, Benedict's gentleness with horses. These are your true treasures." Elisander held his hand, feeling how thin it had become, like holding a bird's wing. Outside, night was falling, bringing with it the sound of the castle settling, timbers creaking gently, guards changing watch with muffled footsteps. Somewhere, a night bird called, its voice carrying across the sleeping valley. Duke Aldrich passed 3 days later, as quietly as a candle being extinguished. The castle bells tolled, but softly, as if they too were mourning. The funeral was attended by nobles from across the land, many of whom looked at young Elisander with calculating eyes, seeing not a grieving daughter but a potential path to power. Yet among the nobility were others, representatives from merchant guilds her father had treated fairly, scholars whose work he had supported, common folk who remembered his justice. They looked at Elisander differently, with something approaching hope. The winter that followed was the quietest anyone could remember. Snow fell in thick, soft curtains, muffling all sound, transforming the familiar landscape into something otherworldly. Elisander spent long hours in her father's study, reading his correspondence, understanding the delicate web of relationships he had cultivated over decades. She discovered letters from unexpected places, from an abbey where monks preserved ancient texts, from a guild of wool merchants in Flanders, from a mysterious woman who signed herself only as S and wrote about the movements of the other claimants to the throne. Each letter was a thread in a tapestry whose pattern was only now becoming clear. Master Johannes remained at the castle, continuing her education but adapting it to her new circumstances. They studied the histories of queens who had ruled in their own right: Matilda of England, Urraca of Leon, Eleanor of Aquitaine before her marriage. Each story contained lessons, some obvious, others hidden like seeds waiting for the right season to sprout. Notice, Johannes would say, pointing to passages in Chronicles, how often these women are described as unnatural or ambitious beyond their station. Yet their reigns often brought prosperity, stability, advancement of learning. The chroniclers, all men, could not reconcile female power with their understanding of the world. So they diminished it, erased it, transformed it into cautionary tales. Spring arrived late that year, as if nature itself was reluctant to wake from winter's peaceful slumber. When it finally came, it brought delegates, representatives from various factions, each hoping to secure Elisande's support for their preferred claimant, or to convince her to abandon her own claim. She received them in the great hall, seated in her father's chair, which seemed too large for her slender frame. Yet there was something about her presence, the way she listened without interrupting, the way her grey eyes seemed to see through pretense to truth, that made grown men shift uncomfortably. Count Roderick came first, a man built like a fortress, all straight lines and sharp angles. He spoke of armies, of the need for strength, of crushing opposition. His words fell into the silence of the hall like stones into a deep pool, creating ripples but no lasting impression. Next came Duke Bertrand, smoother, more polished, offering alliance through marriage to his son, a boy she had met once, whose eyes had the flat quality of a snake's. The Duke spoke of tradition, of maintaining the natural order, of a woman's proper place as supporter, not sovereign. But the most interesting visitor was someone unexpected. Lady Isabel of Courtenay, an elderly woman who had outlived 3 husbands and managed to retain control of vast estates. She came on a day when rain fell gentle as tears, entering the hall with a rustling of silk that sounded like wind through leaves. "They will try to erase you," Lady Isabel said simply, after the formal greetings were done. "Not with swords, that would make you a martyr, but with words, with selective memory, with the slow rewriting of history. I've watched it happen to others, women who dared to reach for power." She paused, sipping wine that glowed ruby in the firelight. "But there are ways to leave marks that cannot be erased, seeds that will grow long after the gardener is forgotten." That conversation lingered in Elisande's mind like the echo of distant bells. What marks could one leave? What seeds could be planted that would survive the deliberate forgetting? As spring deepened toward summer, the political landscape shifted like sand dunes in wind. Alliances formed and dissolved, armies gathered and dispersed. Through it all, Elisande waited, watched, gathered her own kind of power, not the power of swords and soldiers, but something else, something that moved through whispers and wisdom, through unexpected kindnesses and carefully cultivated relationships. She began corresponding with abbesses who controlled vast libraries, with merchant women who understood the flow of gold better than any nobleman, with healers who knew which herbs could cure and which could kill. Each letter was written in her own hand, sealed with wax the color of twilight, sent by messengers who traveled not on main roads but on the old paths, the quiet ways. Summer brought heat that shimmered off stone walls, that made the air thick and dreamlike. The castle seemed to exist in a different realm, separate from the political turmoil beyond its walls. In the gardens, roses bloomed with an intensity that seemed almost desperate, as if they knew their time was limited. It was in those gardens, among the drowsing bees and nodding flower heads, that Elisande met with those who would become her quiet counsel. They gathered in the evening when shadows grew long and soft, when the day's heat began to release its hold, transforming into something gentler, more bearable. Brother Francis arrived first, a young monk from the mountain monastery where Master Johannes had trained. He brought with him copies of texts that weren't supposed to exist, chronicles that told different versions of history, where women's names hadn't yet been scraped away. His voice when he read was like water over smooth stones, continuous, calming, carrying wisdom that had survived centuries of attempted silence. Then came Widow Blackwood, whose husband had been the kingdom's finest mapmaker before fever took him. She had continued his work in secret, her maps showing not just roads and rivers, but trade routes known only to traveling merchants, safe houses where those fleeing persecution could find shelter, hidden valleys where old knowledge was still preserved. Her fingers, stained with ink, would trace paths across parchment while she spoke in undertones about movements of armies that hadn't yet happened, but would. The physician Miriam joined them, a woman who had learned her craft in the universities of Andalusia, where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars still occasionally shared knowledge despite the growing shadows of intolerance. She understood the body's secrets, but more importantly, she understood how power affected health, how stress could poison blood as surely as hemlock, how fear could stop a heart as effectively as a blade. These evening gatherings took on a quality of ritual, though not in any formal sense. More like the way birds gather at dusk, naturally, inevitably, drawn by some instinct older than memory. They would sit in a circle near the fountain whose water fell with a sound like distant rain. Speaking of possibilities, of futures that might unfold like flowers, slow and inevitable. The Duke of Vermilion is ill, Miriam would report, her voice soft as a lamb's wool. His physicians suspect poison, but I believe it's his own ambition eating him from within. He won't last until winter's first snow. The merchant routes through the eastern passes are shifting, Widow Blackwood would add, consulting her maps by the light of lanterns that glowed like captive stars. Whoever controls the new paths will control the flow of silk, spices, knowledge from distant lands. The old nobles don't yet realize how power is changing, moving from castles to counting houses. Brother Francis would share fragments from his forbidden texts. There was a queen in Byzantium, her name carefully obscured, but her deeds still visible if you know how to read between the lines. She ruled not through decree, but through influence, creating schools, hospitals, gardens where scholars could meet and exchange ideas. When her enemies finally moved against her, they found her power had roots too deep to pull. Elisande listened more than she spoke, absorbing their words like dry earth absorbing rain. Understanding began to form in her mind, not sharp and sudden, but gradual, like dawn light spreading across a landscape. Power wasn't what the warriors claimed, wasn't the ability to destroy. True power was the ability to nurture, to connect, to create networks of mutual support that could survive any single person's fall. As summer aged into autumn, painting the world in softer hues, news came that changed everything. Count Roderick had defeated Duke Bertrand in battle, claiming the crown for himself, but his victory was incomplete, disputed. Several regions refused to acknowledge him, including Montmoreau and its surrounding territories. The new king sent envoys demanding Elison's public submission. They arrived on a day when mist rose from the valleys like the earth's own breathing. The lead envoy, Sir Marcus, was a man whose smile never reached his eyes, whose words were honeyed, but whose hand never strayed far from his sword. "His Majesty offers you honor," Sir Marcus proclaimed in the great hall, his voice echoing off stone walls that had heard such proclamations before. "Marry his nephew, bring your lands into the kingdom peacefully, and you shall want for nothing. Refuse." He let the threat hang in the air like smoke. "And winter will be long and cold for Montmoreau." Elison received him wearing a gown, the color of twilight. Neither blue nor grey, but something between. Something hard to define or remember clearly. She listened to his words without expression, letting silence fill the hall after he finished. The silence stretched, grew heavy, until even Sir Marcus began to shift uneasily. "I need time to consider," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the hall. Surely His Majesty would not deny a woman time to pray for guidance, to consult with her advisors, to ensure her people's welfare. The envoy had no choice but to agree, though his eyes narrowed with suspicion. They were given comfortable quarters, fed well, treated with perfect courtesy, and watched, always watched, by eyes they couldn't quite locate. That night Elisande's quiet council met not in the garden, but in the old chapel, a place where stone walls were thick enough to swallow sound, where generations of prayers seemed to have soaked into the very air, making it dense with accumulated hope and sorrow. "He won't wait long," Widow Blackwood observed, unrolling a map that showed troop movements marked in various inks. "Already his soldiers mass at 3 points along our borders. But notice, they're positioned for intimidation, not invasion. He's stretched thin. Other regions resist him. He needs submission through fear, not another costly battle. The church hasn't recognized his coronation," Brother Francis added, candlelight making shadows dance across his young face. "The Archbishop claims to be waiting for a sign from heaven, but really he is waiting to see who will offer the better arrangement for ecclesiastical lands." Miriam had been examining documents with her physician's eye for detail. "Look at the marriage contract they propose. Hidden in the language about dowries and land rights, provisions that would gradually transfer all authority to the nephew. Within 5 years, Montmoreau would be absorbed entirely, its name forgotten." They talked until the candles burned low, their voices growing softer as the night deepened. Plans formed not like buildings being constructed, but like patterns emerging in frost on winter windows, natural, inevitable, beautiful in their complexity. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Lady Isabel had returned, traveling despite her age, her retinue moving through the morning mist like a funeral procession, or perhaps a wedding party. It was hard to tell. She requested a private audience with Elisande, which was granted immediately. They met in the solar, where morning light filtered through windows of pale green glass, creating an underwater quality, as if they spoke from the bottom of a peaceful sea. Lady Isabel had brought a gift, a book bound in leather so old it felt soft as silk. "This belonged to my grandmother," the elderly woman said, her fingers tracing the unmarked cover. "Who received it from hers?" Back and back through generations of women who understood that some knowledge must be preserved outside official histories. Open it when you're alone. Read it slowly. Some truths are too large to swallow all at once. She stayed only an hour, but in that hour she spoke of things that made Elisande's understanding shift like a kaleidoscope turning, revealing new patterns in familiar shapes. She spoke of the queen who never was, a woman whose name had been so thoroughly erased that she was only referred to by absence, yet whose influence could be traced in a dozen laws that still protected the vulnerable, in schools that still taught healing arts, in traditions of sanctuary that even kings dared not violate. They erased her name but not her work, Lady Isabel said, rising to leave with a rustling of heavy silk. Because they didn't understand that her work was her true name, written not in stone but in lives she touched, in changes she made that seemed so small, so natural, that no one thought to undo them. After she left, Elisande sat alone with the ancient book. Its pages were vellum, thin as breath, covered in handwriting that changed every few pages, as if different women had added their pieces over centuries. It wasn't a chronicle of events, but something else. Recipes that were more than recipes. Songs that were more than songs. Patterns for weaving that created more than cloth. One passage caught her eye, written in faded brown ink. "Power is like water. It seems weak, yields to any pressure. Yet over time it carves canyons through solid rock. The secret is not to be the flood that everyone fears and builds walls against, but to be the gentle rain that no one notices until the harvest comes in fuller than ever before." The days that followed took on a strange quality, as if time itself had become thick and golden like honey. Sir Marcus and his envoys grew increasingly impatient, sending messages to their king, receiving orders that became more threatening. Yet somehow their messages were delayed. Their horses developed mysterious lameness. Their messengers took wrong turns on familiar roads. Meanwhile, other messages flowed like underground streams. Letters written in codes that looked like shopping lists. Carrier pigeons that flew at dusk when they were hardest to see. Traveling merchants who carried words sewn into the linings of their cloaks. The network that Duke Aldrich had begun, that Elisande had inherited and expanded, began to pulse with activity. The harvest season arrived with unusual abundance. The granaries of Montmoreau filled to overflowing, while in Count Roderick's newly claimed territories, strange blights affected the crops. Wells ran dry or bitter. Trade routes mysteriously shifted away from his cities. It wasn't magic, though some whispered of curses. It was knowledge, carefully applied. Miriam knew which wells drew from tainted groundwater. Widow Blackwood knew which passes would be blocked by early snow. Brother Francis knew which merchants owed old debts to Montmoreau. Count Roderick, who now styled himself king, sent more envoys, then threats, then finally an army. But the army that arrived at Montmoreau's borders in late autumn found something unexpected. The roads they planned to travel turned to mud after unseasonable rains. The supplies they expected to requisition from villages had already been moved to fortified towns. The guides they hired led them in circles through forests where paths seemed to shift overnight. And then, as the first snows began to fall, something else happened. Other claimants to the throne emerged, strengthened by mysterious donations, supported by merchant guilds that had quietly shifted their allegiances, encouraged by church officials who had received ancient documents questioning Count Roderick's legitimacy. The army threatening Montmoreau was recalled, needed elsewhere, dissolving like morning frost. Winter settled over the land like a great grey cat, soft and heavy and pouring with wind. In the castle, life continued with its gentle rhythms. Elisande spent her days in governance that didn't look like governance, settling disputes with solutions that left both parties feeling heard, ensuring food reached those whose harvests had failed, corresponding with an ever-growing network of women who managed estates, controlled trade, influenced decisions while standing always in the shadows. The book Lady Isabel had given her revealed more secrets as winter deepened. It spoke of an ancient understanding, older than kingdoms, older than written history. When power became too concentrated, too violent, too destructive, there were always those who worked to dilute it, redirect it, transform it into something more nurturing. They didn't fight the storm, they became the shelter from it. One evening, as snow fell silent as feathers outside, Brother Francis brought news that would change everything once more. "Count Roderick is dead," he said simply, his young face grave in the firelight. "Poisoned at his own victory feast. His generals fight among themselves for succession. The kingdom he claimed is fragmenting." The quiet council gathered in the chapel again. But this time their discussion was different, slower, more thoughtful, like rivers that had found their courses and now flowed steadily towards some distant sea. "We could press Elisande's claim now," Widow Blackwood suggested, but even as she said it, her voice carried doubt. With Roderick gone, the other claimants weakened, support from the church and the merchants. But Elisande was looking at something else. A letter that had arrived that morning, sealed with wax the color of old blood. It was from Count Roderick's widow, a woman she had never met, asking for sanctuary. Her children too, 3 young ones who had no part in their father's ambitions but would surely suffer for them. "What if," Elisande began, her voice soft as snowfall, "what if we offered something different? Not another claim to a broken throne, but a different model entirely. Sanctuary for all who seek it. Trade agreements that benefit everyone. Knowledge shared rather than hoarded. Power distributed like irrigation channels, reaching every field rather than pooling in one reservoir." The conversation continued deep into the night, voices growing ever softer, ideas flowing together like streams joining a river. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing the harsh edges of the world, making everything soft and unified and peaceful. By dawn, a new understanding had emerged. Elisande would not claim the throne, not openly. Instead, she would build something else, a network of mutual support that crossed borders, that ignored traditional hierarchies, that connected abbeys and merchant houses, healers and scholars, common folk and noble women, all bound not by oaths of fealty but by shared benefit. The widow of Count Roderick arrived a week later, her children huddled close, fear still sharp in their eyes. Elisande received them not in the great hall, but in the solar, where warm light and comfortable chairs made everything less formal, less frightening. "I know what you're building," the widow said after her children had been taken to warm beds and hot soup. "My husband spoke of you with fear, but also puzzlement. He couldn't understand power that didn't seek to dominate. But I understand. I've always understood. Women learn early that survival sometimes means being like water, finding the cracks, the spaces between, the underground channels." She became another thread in the growing tapestry, bringing knowledge of her late husband's alliances, his enemies, the weak points in traditional power structures. Her name was Constance, and she would later be remembered, when she was remembered at all, as a traitor to her husband's memory. But in truth, she was loyal to something larger, older, more lasting. Spring returned as it always did, inevitable as breathing. The political landscape had changed completely. No single ruler claimed the whole kingdom. Instead, a patchwork of smaller territories emerged, each governing itself, connected by trade agreements and mutual defense pacts that somehow, mysteriously, always seemed to benefit Montmoreau. Elisande received many marriage proposals that season, from lords who sensed her influence even if they couldn't understand its source. She declined them all with perfect courtesy, always finding reasons that couldn't quite be argued with. Her health was delicate. She needed to manage her father's legacy. She had made private vows of chastity. The excuses varied, but the result was the same. She remained unmarried, ungoverned by any man's authority. The years that followed moved like honey pouring from a jar, slow and golden and sweet, each season blending into the next with barely perceptible changes. Elisande aged as all mortals do, though those who knew her swore she carried her years more gently than most, as if time itself had made some quiet agreement to tread softly in her presence. Her hair, once the color of wheat before harvest, gradually took on the silver tones of moonlight on water. Lines appeared at the corners of her eyes, but they were the kind that came from smiling, from squinting at manuscripts in candlelight, from looking toward distant horizons where possibilities gathered like clouds. Her voice, always soft, became even softer, until listening to her required a particular kind of stillness, the kind that allows one to hear their own heartbeat. The castle at Montmoreau transformed under her quiet guidance, though the changes happened so gradually that visitors could never quite say when things had shifted. The great hall, once a place of loud feasts and louder arguments, became something more like a library, where scholars gathered to share knowledge in hushed tones, where merchants negotiated deals that somehow left everyone feeling satisfied, where travelers from distant lands were welcomed with the understanding that their stories were as valuable as any gold they might carry. Gardens expanded beyond the original walls, spilling into what had once been training grounds for knights, where men had once practiced with swords. Now medicinal herbs grew in carefully tended rows, their scents mingling on warm afternoons, lavender and chamomile, sage and thyme, rosemary that released its fragrance when brushed by passing skirts. The gardeners were mostly women now, many of them widows or unmarried daughters who had nowhere else to go. They found purpose here, tending plants that would become medicines, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Brother Francis, no longer young, had established a scriptorium in the castle's east wing, where texts were copied with infinite patience. But these weren't just religious manuscripts. Hidden among the prayers and psalms were other things. Astronomical observations that challenged accepted wisdom. Medical treatments that actually worked. Histories that remembered names the official chronicles had forgotten. The scribes worked in companionable silence, their quills scratching softly like mice in the walls, creating rhythms that could lull observers into peaceful meditation. Miriam had founded what she called a house of healing, though it was more than that. Women came from across the region to learn the physician's arts, not just the mixing of tinctures and setting of bones, but the deeper understanding of how bodies and spirits intertwined, how fear could cause fever, how hope could speed recovery, how the moon's phases affected more than just the tides. The students lived simply, rising before dawn to tend the herb gardens, spending afternoons in study, evenings in practical application. Their presence filled the castle with a sense of purposeful calm. Widow Blackwood, now truly ancient, had passed her map-making skills to a group of apprentices, young women with steady hands and sharp eyes, who understood that maps were more than representations of physical space. They were records of possibility, showing not just what was but what could be. Secret routes that refugees might travel, hidden valleys where communities could flourish outside the reach of violent lords, springs that never ran dry even in drought years. Their workshop smelled of ink and parchment, of the special wax used to seal documents, of the bitter tea they drank to keep their eyes sharp during long sessions of detailed work. The influence of Montmoreau spread like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, but so gently that few noticed the pattern. Trade agreements were reached that seemed unremarkable individually, but together created a web of interdependence that made war increasingly impractical. Marriages were arranged, not grand political alliances but smaller ones, between merchant families and minor nobles, between scholars and healers, creating bonds that crossed traditional boundaries. Elisande herself remained at the center of this quiet transformation, though she would have said she was merely a point through which various threads passed. She spent her mornings in correspondence, writing letters in her increasingly spidery hand, each one carefully crafted to seem like casual conversation while containing seeds of ideas that would bloom months or years later. Afternoons found her in the solar with visitors, always listening more than speaking, her grey eyes patient as winter skies. One such visitor was a young woman named Joanna, daughter of a baron who had died in one of the endless small wars that still plagued the edges of the realm. She arrived angry, desperate, seeking revenge against those who had killed her father. Her grief was sharp as broken glass, cutting anyone who came too close. Elisande received her in the evening garden, where dusk was painting everything in shades of purple and grey, where the fountain's constant murmur made all conversation feel like secrets. She listened to Joanna's fury without interrupting, letting the words pour out like poison being drawn from a wound. When the younger woman finally exhausted herself, silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, but expectant, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Revenge is a fire that burns the one who carries it, Elisande finally said, her words falling soft as ash. But there are other forms of justice. Slower perhaps, but more lasting. Would you like to learn them? Joanna stayed at Montmoreau for 3 years. During that time, her anger didn't disappear but transformed, like metal being forged into something useful. She learned law from Brother Francis, studying precedents that stretched back to Roman times. She learned economics from the merchant women, understanding how financial pressure could accomplish what armies couldn't. She learned the art of correspondence from Elisande herself, how to write letters that seem to say one thing while meaning another, how to build alliances through shared interests rather than shared enemies. When Joanna finally left, she didn't raise an army against her father's killers. Instead, she established trading posts that gradually drew commerce away from their lands. She married strategically, not for love but for influence, placing herself at the center of a network that slowly, patiently, inevitably reduced her enemies to irrelevance. They died not in battle but in poverty, their names forgotten not through deliberate erasure but through simple lack of importance. Stories like Joanna's multiplied through the years. Women who came to Montmoreau broken or desperate, leaving with different kinds of strength. They spread across the realm and beyond, carrying with them the quiet teachings they had absorbed. Some became abbesses of convents that mysteriously prospered while others struggled. Some married into royal courts where they influenced policy through pillow talk and carefully timed suggestions. Others established guilds that gave craftswomen the same protections men had always enjoyed. The chroniclers of the age barely noticed. Their attention was fixed on the movements of armies, the grand gestures of kings and princes, the spectacular battles and dramatic betrayals that made for exciting stories. They didn't see the subtle shift in how things worked, the gradual erosion of old power structures, the emergence of something new growing in the spaces between. There was one chronicle though, a monk named Adelard, who sensed something happening. He came to Montmoreau in Elisande's 60th year, claiming to be writing a history of the duchy. His real purpose was less clear, perhaps even to himself. He spent months in the castle's library, reading correspondence that should have been private, observing patterns that should have been invisible. "You're building something," he said to Elisande one evening, as rain fell gently on the garden outside. "Not a kingdom, not an empire, something else, something that doesn't have a name." She smiled, the expression barely disturbing the lines of her face. "I'm an old woman tending her father's legacy," she replied. "Nothing more dramatic than that. Would you like more wine? It's from our own vineyards. The vines are old now. Their roots go very deep." Adelard's chronicle, when he finally wrote it, mentioned Elisande only, briefly, a dutiful daughter who managed her father's estates competently, who never married, dedicating herself instead to charitable works, who established some hospitals and schools. a footnote in the larger history of the realm. Yet scattered throughout his text were oddities, references to events that didn't quite connect, patterns that suggested influence without revealing their source. As if he had tried to describe a vast underground river by noting where flowers grew more lushly on the surface. The seasons continued their eternal rotation. Elisander's movements grew slower, more deliberate, like a dancer who had learned that grace came not from speed but from intention. She walked with a stick now, carved from an apple tree that had stood in the garden since before her birth. Its wood was smooth from handing, warm to the touch even on cold days. Her council had evolved over the years, the original members aging, dying, being replaced by those they had trained. But the nature of their gatherings remained the same. Quiet conversations in places where stone walls absorbed sound, plans that unfolded over years rather than days, power exercised through influence rather than command. One winter evening, as snow fell thick and silent outside, Constance came to Elisande's chambers. She too had aged, her once sharp features softened by time. They sat by the fire. Two old women who had shaped the world in ways the world would never acknowledge. "My son wants to claim his father's throne," Constance said, her voice carrying weariness heavier than years. He's gathered supporters, promises of restoration, of returning to the old ways. Elisander stared into the fire, watching flames dance their ancient dance. "And what do you want?" she asked finally. "I want what we've always wanted," Constance replied. "A world where power serves instead of consuming, where strength isn't measured in ability to destroy, where my grandchildren can grow without fear of being erased for being different." They talked until the fire burned low, their voices becoming whispers, then murmurs, then comfortable silence. Plans were made that night, though they would have seemed like no plans at all to anyone listening. Just two old women reminiscing about gardens and grandchildren, about recipes for preserving fruit, about the proper way to bind books so they would last centuries. Constance's son did raise his army, did march on the capital, did proclaim himself the rightful heir. But strange things happened. His supplies were delayed by unexpected storms. His allies received letters that made them reconsider their positions. His soldiers fell ill with a sickness that weakened but didn't kill, leaving them unable to fight but requiring care that drained resources. Within 6 months, his grand crusade had dissolved into nothing. He retired to a monastery, claiming to have received a vision calling him to contemplation rather than conquest. The world never knew that his own mother had orchestrated his defeat, using networks she had helped build, applying pressure so gently that it felt like fate rather than intention. Constance felt no guilt. Love sometimes meant preventing those we cherished from becoming monsters. As Elisander entered her 70th year, changes in the wider realm became harder to ignore. The violent conflicts that had characterized the previous generation were growing rare, not eliminated. Humans were still humans, but contained, limited, resolved through negotiation more often than bloodshed. Trade was flourishing. Knowledge was spreading. The rigid hierarchies that had seemed eternal were softening, becoming more permeable. Scholars would later attribute these changes to various causes: the influence of the church, the rise of the merchant class, the exhaustion that followed generations of war. They weren't wrong, but they weren't complete either. They didn't see the network of women who had quietly, patiently, persistently worked to create conditions where these changes could take root. Elisande received fewer visitors now. Her eyes had grown cloudy, making reading difficult. Her hearing had faded, requiring people to lean close when speaking to her, but her mind remained clear as mountain air, her understanding deep as still water. Those who came to her in these final years found someone who seemed already half translated into another realm. Present, but not entirely present, listening to music others couldn't hear. She spent increasing time in the castle's highest tower, where windows looked out in all directions, where she could feel the world breathing around her. The tower room was simple, almost austere, containing only a chair, a small table, and the ancient book Lady Isabel had given her so many years ago. She would sit for hours, not reading, just holding the book, feeling the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who had walked similar paths. Young women still came to learn, though what they learned was harder to articulate. They sat with her in that tower room, absorbing something through proximity rather than instruction. Understanding that power wasn't something to be grasped, but something to flow through. That influence worked best when it couldn't be traced. That the greatest victories were the ones no one noticed. One such student was Margaret, great niece of Brother Francis, sharp as winter wind and twice as restless. She had come expecting to learn strategies, techniques, methods of manipulation. Instead, she found herself learning patience, silence, the art of not doing that could accomplish more than any action. "How do you know when to act and when to wait?" Margaret asked one afternoon, as sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Elisande's answer came slowly, words separated by long pauses, as if she were translating from some ancient language. "You learn to feel the currents, like a bird knows when to migrate, not through thought, but through some deeper knowing. Action taken at the wrong moment is like planting seeds in winter. They die before they can grow. But the same action at the right moment, when conditions have been carefully prepared, can transform everything while seeming to do nothing at all." These conversations were recorded by Margaret, though not in any official chronicle. She kept a private journal written in a cipher of her own devising. Hidden in those coded pages were the real teachings of Montmoreau, the accumulation of generations of women's wisdom about power, influence, survival, transformation. The spring of Elisande's 73rd year brought unusual warmth. Gardens bloomed earlier than anyone could remember. Birdsong filled the air from dawn to dusk. The world seemed to be celebrating something, though what, no one could say. Elisande spent most days in the garden now, moving slowly between the herb beds and flower borders. Sometimes standing still for so long that birds would perch on her shoulders. Her inner circle had grown smaller. Death had claimed many. Others had moved on to continue the work elsewhere. But a core remained. Women who understood that they were guardians of something precious, something that needed to be preserved and passed on, even if its true nature could never be openly acknowledged. They met less frequently now, but when they did gather, their conversations had a quality of summation, of completion. They spoke of seeds planted that were finally bearing fruit, of changes that had seemed impossible now becoming inevitable, of a future where their work might no longer be necessary, where power might naturally flow in healthier channels. The old king is dying, someone reported at one such gathering. His son speaks of reform, of councils where merchants and scholars have voices equal to nobles, of laws that protect the weak from the strong. 3 new universities have been chartered, another added, all accepting women as students, though they must dress as men and use male names. Still, it's a beginning. The trade routes we established are now the main arteries of commerce, a third observed. Cities that resisted our influence have withered. Those that welcomed it prosper. Economics accomplishing what armies never could. Elisander listened to these reports with closed eyes, nodding occasionally, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth like sunlight on water. When they finished, she spoke, her voice barely above a breath. We have been like gardeners tending a forest. No one sees our work, but slowly, patiently. We've encouraged certain trees, discouraged others, created clearings where light could enter. The forest is transforming, becoming something healthier, more diverse, more resilient. That summer brought a fever to the region. Not the violent plague that had swept through in previous generations, but something gentler, that laid people low but rarely killed. Elisander caught it in late July, when the air was thick with the scent of ripening fruit. She took to her bed without complaint, seeming almost relieved to finally lay down the burdens she had carried so long. Those who attended her in those final days would later speak of the strange peace that filled her chamber, like being underwater in a warm bath, where sounds came muffled and movements seemed to slow. The room smelled of lavender and old roses, of beeswax candles that had burned for decades, of the particular mixture of herbs Miriam had taught them to use for ease in difficult passages. Though this passage seemed anything but difficult, more like a boat drifting downstream on a summer evening, inevitable and gentle. Elisande lay in the great bed where she had been born, where her mother had died bringing her into the world. The bed curtains, heavy silk embroidered with patterns of flowering vines, filtered the light into something golden and soft, creating a world within the world. She seemed to shrink into the pillows, becoming smaller, lighter, as if she were already beginning the process of transformation from flesh into memory. Margaret sat beside her through the long afternoons, reading from the ancient book in a voice that barely disturbed the air. The words were in languages that shifted and blended. Latin flowing into Arabic, French, melted into something older, pre-Roman, pre-written, sounds that carried meaning below the level of understanding, like lullabies whose words don't matter. Only the rhythm, the tone, the feeling of being held in safety. There was a queen, Margaret read, though whether she was reading or remembering or inventing was impossible to say. Whose name was written in water, whose crown was made of shadows, whose throne was the space between heartbeats. She ruled not by commanding but by allowing, not by grasping but by releasing. And her kingdom was everywhere and nowhere, as real as breathing and as impossible to capture. Elisande's lips moved slightly, forming words no one could hear. Or perhaps she was simply breathing in a way that looked like speech. Her hands, thin as parchment now, rested on the coverlet like fallen leaves, occasionally lifting slightly as if conducting some silent music, or beckoning to visitors only she could see. The others came to say their farewells, though the word seemed wrong somehow, too final for what felt more like a gradual dissolving. Constance brought wildflowers from the meadow beyond the castle walls, arranging them in patterns that had meaning in the old language of flowers. Farewell, but also gratitude. Ending, but also continuation. Brother Francis, ancient now himself, sat quietly in the corner, his prayer beads moving through his fingers in rhythms that had nothing to do with Orthodox Christianity and everything to do with older forms of meditation. The fever had broken after 3 days, but Elisanda hadn't returned with it. She lingered in some in-between place, neither fully here nor fully gone. Her breathing so shallow, it barely moved the covers. Her pulse so faint that sometimes those watching had to lean close to confirm she still remained. Yet there was no distress in her state, rather a quality of waiting, like morning mist waiting for the sun to transform it into something else. On the 5th day, as evening approached with clouds like vast grey wings spreading across the sky, she opened her eyes fully for the first time. They were clear, clearer than they had been in years, as if the cataracts that had clouded them had been burned away by fever, or perhaps by something else. She looked at each person in the room, really looked, seeing not just their faces but through them, to something essential. "The work continues," she said, her voice stronger than it should have been, carrying that quality it had always had of requiring absolute attention. Not our work anymore, but the work itself. It has roots now, deep enough to survive any storm, branches wide enough to shelter generations we'll never see. You've all been gardeners, tending something too large to see its full shape, but I've seen it in dreams, in the spaces between waking and sleeping. And it's beautiful, so beautiful. She paused, gathering breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than lungs. There will be others who try to claim they shaped history, kings and generals whose names will fill the chronicles. Let them have their stories. We know the truth, that real change happens in whispers, in kindness, given when no one's watching, in connections made between people who shouldn't have anything in common, in knowledge preserved when others would destroy it, in refuge offered when the world says turn away. The room had filled without anyone noticing. Servants and nobles alike drawn by something, standing in the doorway and along the walls, creating a congregation that had no name and needed none. Some were crying, but softly, tears like spring rain that nourishes rather than floods. "I want to tell you about the queen history tried to hide," Elisande continued, and her voice now had that storytelling quality that could make time stop. She wasn't me, though I've lived her story in my own way. She wasn't any one woman. She was all of us. Every woman who chose influence over dominance, patience over violence, nurturing over destroying. We are the queen they couldn't erase because we were never just one person, never in just one place, never containable in their simple stories of power. Night had fallen completely now, but candles had been lit. Dozens of them, creating a golden glow that made everyone look younger, softer, more beautiful. Or perhaps it was something else that transformed them. Some quality of the moment that made the ordinary sacred. "Before I go," Elisande said, and the word "go" hung in the air like a note from a distant bell. "I want you to understand something. We didn't fail because our names won't be remembered. We succeeded because our work will continue without our names. Every time a powerful man chooses negotiation over war because it's become the practical choice, every time knowledge is shared instead of hoarded because networks make hoarding impossible, every time a woman finds her voice because spaces we created still exist, we succeed again, and again, and again, echoing forward through time like ripples that never quite fade." She closed her eyes then. Not in death, but in something that looked like the deepest meditation. Her breathing became so regular it was hypnotic, drawing everyone else's breath into the same rhythm. The candles flickered but didn't go out. Shadows danced but gently, like underwater plants swaying in an unfelt current. Margaret began to sing, or perhaps hum, a melody that had no words but didn't need them. Others joined, harmonies weaving together, creating something that wasn't quite music, but was musical. Wasn't quite prayer, but was prayerful. The sound filled the chamber, spilled into the corridors, drifted through windows into the night where an owl called once, twice, then fell silent, as if listening. Through the night they kept vigil, though it felt less like watching and more like participating in something. A transformation maybe, or a translation from one state to another. The castle itself seemed to hold its breath. Stones that had witnessed centuries of life and death, understanding that this was something different, special, worth their ancient attention. As the first grey light of dawn began to soften the darkness outside, making the world neither night nor day, but something between, Elisande stirred slightly. Her eyes remained closed, but her lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Look," she whispered, though whether she spoke aloud or everyone simply heard the same thought was uncertain. "Look how the light comes, not all at once, not violent, just a gradual brightening, an inevitable arrival of something that was always approaching. That's how we change things. That's how change really happens. So slowly that those who resist don't notice until it's too late to stop. So gently that even those who benefit might not realize the gift they've been given." The sun rose fully then, painting the chamber in colors that had no names. Colors that existed only in that particular moment when night transformed into day. And in that light, Elisande seemed to become translucent, as if she were made of stained glass with light passing through, still breathing, still present, but also somehow already elsewhere, already part of something larger. "The book," she said, and Margaret understood, bringing the ancient volume to rest under Elisande's hands. "Add to it, all of you. Keep adding. Let it grow like a garden where each generation plants new seeds. Some will be forgotten. Some will fail to germinate. But some will grow into things we never imagined. That's the real legacy. Not monuments with our names, but gardens others will tend without knowing who first broke the ground." The morning progressed with impossible slowness, as if time itself had become thick and golden. Visitors came and went, or perhaps they were always there, faces blending into each other. Young women who would carry the work forward. Old women who had carried it this far. Children who didn't yet understand what they were witnessing but would remember. Would tell stories years later about the morning when the light behaved strangely and everyone spoke in whispers. By noon, though noon seemed like a concept from another world. Elisander's breathing had become so shallow, it was barely distinguishable from the castle's own breathing, from the wind's breathing, from the breathing of everyone gathered. She had become part of the larger rhythm, individual notes dissolving into harmony. "Listen," someone said, though who spoke was impossible to determine. "Listen to how quiet it is." And it was quiet, quieter than silence, a quiet that went deeper than the absence of sound. The kind of quiet that exists in the space between thoughts, in the moment between sleeping and waking, in the pause between one breath and the next. In that quiet, Elisander spoke her last words, though perhaps spoke isn't the right term. Perhaps her thoughts simply became audible, or perhaps everyone simply knew what she was thinking. "We are all the queen history tried to hide," she said, or thought, or somehow conveyed. "We are all the power that flows beneath, the influence that can't be traced, the change that happens so slowly it seems like nature itself. Remember that, when they write their histories without us, we were here. We are here. We will always be here, in the spaces between their words, in the work that continues, in the garden that grows." And then, with no dramatic moment, no clear transition, she was gone. Or rather, she had completed her transformation from singular to plural, from presence to influence, from a woman lying in her bed to something dispersed through all the women she had touched, taught, influenced. Her body remained, but it was clearly now just a shell, something left behind, like a coat no longer needed. The funeral, when it came 3 days later, was a strange affair. Official chroniclers would record it as a simple ceremony for a minor duchess who had never married, never bore children, never did anything of particular note. But those who were there remembered it differently. How people came from impossible distances, people who shouldn't have known, shouldn't have cared. How the ceremony seemed to happen in multiple languages simultaneously. How flowers that shouldn't bloom in that season covered the grave. How a network revealed itself for just a moment, like seeing the pattern in a tapestry by looking at its back. Count Roderick's son, the one who had tried to claim his throne, emerged from his monastery to attend. He said nothing, but left gold for the establishment of a school that would accept anyone who could learn, regardless of birth or gender. Though, of course, the official documents wouldn't phrase it quite that way. The Archbishop himself came, bringing a letter from Rome that would have seemed strange if anyone had been able to read the Latin properly. It spoke of a special dispensation, of recognition of works of charity, but between the lines, in the spaces where words weren't, it acknowledged something else. A parallel structure that had always existed alongside the official church. Women who had preserved the deeper mysteries while men argued about doctrine. But perhaps the strangest moment came at sunset, when the official ceremonies were over and only the inner circle remained. Margaret opened the ancient book to add Elisander's story, only to find it already there, written in handwriting she didn't recognize, in ink that looked fresh but felt old. The story was different from what had happened, but also the same. True in the way that dreams are true, capturing essence rather than fact. And at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that might have been Elisande's or might have been older, much older, were words that seemed to pulse with their own light. She was never hidden, only transformed, never erased, only dispersed, never forgotten, only renamed in every act of quiet courage, every moment of patient change, every choice of nurturing over destroying. She is the queen who lives in the spaces between, who rules from the shadows, who wins by never fighting. Find her in yourself, in your sisters, in your daughters, in the work that continues. The years that followed saw the completion of many things Elisande had begun, though her name was rarely attached to them. Trade routes that had been suggestions became major thoroughfares of commerce and ideas. Schools that had been experiments became institutions. Network that had been informal became, well, they remained informal. That was their strength. But they became stronger, more extensive, reaching into places no official power could touch. Margaret took over the leadership of Montmoreau, though leadership wasn't quite the right word. She became more like a gardener tending an established garden, knowing when to prune and when to let grow wild, when to plant new seeds and when to let the soil rest. She added to the ancient book regularly, as did others. The book somehow never running out of pages, always having room for one more story, one more piece of wisdom, one more name. That history would forget, but the work would remember. The castle evolved into something that had no real precedent. Part school, part sanctuary, part hospital, part library. A place where women came to learn arts that weren't quite medicine, weren't quite scholarship, weren't quite statecraft, but somehow were all of these things. They would leave with skills that couldn't quite be named, returning to their homes to practice influence that couldn't quite be traced. Some became the powers behind thrones, whispering suggestions that became policies. Some became abbesses of convents that somehow always had enough food for the hungry, enough shelter for the desperate. Some became merchants whose trade networks did more to prevent wars than any treaty. Some simply became mothers who raised children differently. Children who grew up assuming women's voices mattered, who couldn't quite understand why anyone would think otherwise. The chroniclers of the age continued to write their histories, stories of kings and battles, of great men doing great deeds. They mentioned Montmoreau occasionally, usually in footnotes. A minor duchy that remained strangely stable while others rose and fell. Notable mainly for its exports of herbs and honey, for its tradition of educating daughters as well as sons, for its unusual number of female merchants and healers, oddities that didn't quite fit the narrative, like finding shells on a mountaintop. Evidence of vast changes that happened too slowly to witness. But in other chronicles, the ones written in cipher, in books hidden in abbey walls, in letters that looked like recipes, in songs that sounded like lullabies, a different history was preserved. The story of the queen history tried to hide, who was never one woman but many, who ruled not from a throne but from the spaces between, who won not through conquest but through transformation so gradual it seemed like nature itself. And now, As this story settles into the approaching silence, as the candles burn lower and the night grows deeper, perhaps you can feel her presence still. Not as a ghost or a memory, but as something more pervasive. In the gentle way power can be exercised without violence. In the patient way change can happen without revolution. In the quiet way influence can spread without anyone noticing its source. She's there in every moment when strength chooses gentleness, when power chooses to nurture rather than destroy. When someone remembers that the mightiest rivers begin as tiny springs, patient and persistent, wearing away the hardest stone not through force but through time, through constancy, through the quiet determination to keep flowing. The castle at Marlborough still stands, though much changed, its stones worn smooth by centuries of weather, its halls filled with different voices now. Yet sometimes, especially in the point evening when the light slants just so, when the air is heavy with the scent of old roses and lavender, visitors report a strange feeling. Not haunting exactly, more like recognition, as if the walls themselves remember, and in remembering, remind us that history is written by the victors. But victory isn't always what it seems. That power can flow through channels too subtle to map. That influence can spread like morning mist, everywhere and nowhere. Impossible to grasp, but impossible to ignore. That some queens rule not from thrones but from the quiet spaces where real change begins. And perhaps, as your breathing slows, as your thoughts begin to drift like boats on a calm river, you might remember her too. Not as a specific person from a specific time, but as something eternal. Something that exists wherever patience overcomes force, wherever gentleness transforms hardness, wherever the quiet work of building supersedes the loud work of destroying. The story dissolves now, like sugar in warm tea, like mist in morning sunshine, like dreams upon waking. But something remains, something that was always there, waiting to be remembered. The understanding that true power doesn't announce itself, doesn't need monuments or chronicles, doesn't require recognition. It simply continues, patient as stone, gentle as water, inevitable as the seasons, working its quiet magic in the spaces between our conscious thoughts. And so, her story becomes part of the night's gentle tapestry, woven into your approaching dreams. If you're still listening, perhaps another tale awaits in the realm of sleep, or perhaps just peaceful, quiet, endless, peaceful sleep where all stories merge into one, where all queens rule from shadows, where all power flows like underground rivers, nurturing the world above without ever needing to break the surface, just flowing, flowing, endlessly, peacefully, flowing.